Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this second meeting. Before we start, I'll go through the usual housekeeping matters. There is no fire alarm expected today, so if it goes off, then we need to evacuate, which I'm sure we're capable of doing. The meeting will be broadcast live to the internet and will be capable of subsequent repeat viewing. By entering the Warspite room and during the course of the meeting, committee members are consenting to being filmed and to the use of those recordings for webcasting. Please, can I ask that you speak clearly and directly into your microphone and switch it on, which all of us tend to forget, when addressing the meeting so that other online participants and the public can hear, and it's switched off when you're not using it, and your mobile devices are turned to silent. On that front, at some point, if I do get a phone call from a number I don't recognise, I might just nip out because I rescued a stray Siamese cat from a lay-by last night, which is microchipped, so there might be a call from the owner, but more likely this afternoon. So we move to the next item, to appoint a vice chair, and I am very pleased to propose Councillor Sue MacDonald as vice chair for the rest of the year, if that's acceptable. Do I have a seconder?
I'd certainly like to second that. Thank you, Mary.
And everyone in favour? Good. Thought it would be non-controversial, so welcome as vice chair.
That's a good start.
Apologies. Do you want me to give these out, Elliot, or will you give them out? We've had apologies from Councillor Patrick Nicholson, who was on leave, and Councillor Cathy Watkins kindly agreed to substitute. Apologies from Ruth Harrell, Director of Public Health, who's on leave, and Rob Nelder's deputising, but you would have been here anyway, I think, Rob, for the major presentation. So, and apologies from Anna Cole, Service Director for Integrated Commissioning. Apologies from Sharon Muldoon, Director of Children's Services, and apologies from Tony Gravitt from Health Watch, who's on annual leave, but someone is standing in for him, presumably to present the report.
No report from Health Watch today, Chair.
Oh, we were thinking we had one, weren't we? On the cost of living? No, that's Citizens Advice. Citizens Advice, yeah, okay, thanks. Any declarations of interest? No, I have no urgent business. Minutes of the 30th of June. Is everyone happy with the minutes as they are?
Yeah, I'm happy.
And happy that I sign them later?
Second that.
Everyone agreed? Yep, thank you. So this brings us on to major item, pharmaceutical needs assessment, which Rob has obviously spent a lot of time preparing a very comprehensive report. So I will pass over to Rob, and Dave, you will be having some input as well at some point. But yes, right. Thank you. Fire away, Rob.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. Before I start, although I'm presenting this report to the board today, I just wanted to make it very clear that it's, and I will say a bit more about this further on, that it's very much a team effort. I wanted to particularly thank Carol Harmon, who is sat in the what I always refer to as the cheap seats at the back here. Carol did a huge amount of work in producing the PNA itself, and as I say, you know, led most of it from Plymouth's perspective, and also big thanks to Sue Taylor, who's the Chief Officer of the Devon Local Pharmaceutical Committee, who's on the call today virtually. Sue was, as ever, incredibly helpful in the production of the report. So I particularly wanted to thank Carol and Sue for their input into the report that you've got in your pack today. So if we can just move on to the next slide, please. What I'm going to cover today is basically what is a PNA, what's in it and what's it used for, the process of developing the PNA. I'll say a bit about the locality summaries and how important they are, and also the gap analysis. The gap analysis is probably the most important bit of the PNA. Then obviously to reassure you about the consultation process that we went through, and then there's the recommendation for the board at the end. So if we can just move on to the next slide, please. in terms of what is a PNA, and sorry that these slides are a bit wordy. A PNA, so it's a comprehensive assessment of the current and future pharmaceutical needs of the local population for community pharmacy, dispensing appliance contractors, and dispensing doctors in rural areas. So that last one isn't relevant to us. But so it's a comprehensive assessment of the current and future pharmaceutical needs of the local population. So that's it in a nutshell. Why do we have to do it, and why is it coming to this board? Well, that's as a result of the Health and Social Care Act 2012, which transferred responsibilities for the production of PNAs to health and wellbeing boards, and that came in on the 1st of April, obviously. So Plymouth's Health and Wellbeing Board has a legal duty to ensure the production of a PNA for Plymouth, and the way that tends to be done is that, I suppose in simple terms, the chair of the Health and Wellbeing Board tends to speak to the Director of Public Health and say, we need to produce a PNA, and then the Director of Public Health speaks to their team, and their team tends to be part of the group that produces it. So, but ultimately, it is the responsibility of the Health and Wellbeing Board to ensure the production of a pharmaceutical needs assessment of a PNA. So Health and Wellbeing Boards had to produce their first one on the 1st of April 2015, and then it's a three-year cycle after that. So our last PNA was published in March 2018. So those of you who can do the maths will realise that we should have produced one in March 2021, but obviously as a result of the pandemic, the production of PNAs was put on hold initially for a 12-month period, and then there was a further extension up to the point we're at now. So we have to publish our PNA by the 1st of October 2022. So I'm hoping today that you'll be able to sign this off so we can meet that deadline. So if we could just move on to the next slide, please. So what's in it, and what's it used for? It's ends up being quite a weighty tome. I think you can see from the report that you've got in front of you. It's about 130, 140 pages long. It's a massive amount of information in it. It presents a picture of community pharmacy and provision in Plymouth, and it links with our joint strategic needs assessment. So there's a lot of information in the PNA that we tell others who are interested in public health in the city as well, or health and wellbeing in the city, because we don't really want it just to be used for those people interested in pharmacy. There's a load of health and wellbeing related information in it that others are interested in too. So we always point people to the PNA if people want a quick overview of health and wellbeing in Plymouth as well. And basically, if a pharmacy or a dispensing appliance contractor wants to provide pharmaceutical services, they have to apply to NHS England to be included in the pharmaceutical list. But basically, they have to make reference to the PNA. So, and that's really why in the PNA we include a section on gap analysis, because that's particularly important, because what we don't want is over provision. We don't want under provision. We want the right amount of provision now. We want the right amount of provision in the future, and we want to make sure that the right services are available to the residents of Plymouth. But in short, any provider of pharmacy services who wants to set up from scratch or expand services or change services in the city, they have to make reference to the PNA and in effect be fulfilling a need that's identified within that PNA. And as I've already alluded to, identified needs could be current, they could be or they could be future, and by future I mean they could arise within the lifetime of the PNA, that three-year period. So if we can just move on to the next slide, just to really summarise what the PNA is and what it's used for. So it will be used by NHS England predominantly. So it will be used by NHS England to inform the decisions that they will make regarding which NHS-funded services need to be provided by community pharmacies and dispensing appliance contractors. So NHS England will use the PNA to make those decisions. NHS England will then use it to decide whether new pharmacies or services are needed. They'll also use it to inform decision-making about the relocation of existing pharmaceutical premises. And also they'll use it to decide about the commissioning of locally enhanced services. And providers of pharmaceutical services will use the PNA to inform their applications, and they'll use it to demonstrate that they're meeting a need or a gap in service that's set out in the PNA. So that's really why the gap analysis section is particularly important. I mean, to give you a simple hypothetical example, if I was a provider of pharmacy services, we'll call it Rob's Pharmacy. If I wanted to open a branch of Rob's Pharmacy on Mutley Plain, I would look at the PNA and think, actually, is there a gap on Mutley Plain or not? The PNA would tell me that there isn't a gap in pharmacy provision in and around the Mutley area, so NHS England would more than likely decline my application to open Rob's Pharmacy on Mutley Plain. That's what they're going to use it. That's what, in simple terms, a really simple example of what NHS England will use the PNA for, just to decide whether there are current gaps or future gaps that they think should be filled by a new or additional provision of pharmacy services. So we can just move on, Elliot, to the next one, please. So in terms of developing the PNA, it was developed in partnership with a Devon-wide steering group. So as we've done for the last 3 iterations of the pharmaceutical needs assessment, it's been a multi-agency partnership group across Devon as a whole that's produced the PNA. We've had a steering group that's met to make sure that the PNAs were produced in accordance with regulation and guideline. And it was also important to ensure that the PNAs for Plymouth, Devon and Torbay had a similar structure and had the same sort of locally relevant information. But what was particularly important was, by doing that, it allowed us to have conversations about boundary issues as well, because, you know, if we consider Plymouth for a minute, there are obviously developments around the outskirts of Plymouth that would impact upon pharmacy provision, and also a number of people come into Plymouth for their services. An example of where we've had to consider that would be Sherford. Some of the Sherford development is in Plymouth, but some of it's in the South Hams, but some of the Sherford residents would come to Plymouth to access pharmaceutical services, and also areas like Woolwell. Woolwell isn't within the Plymouth city boundary, but Woolwell residents would probably tend to use the pharmacy at the Tesco at Roborough there. And also we have to consider things like future housing developments and the impact that will have on pharmacy. So that's why it's important for us to work with partners across Devon and Torbay, because, for example, if the new housing development takes place in Woolwell as planned in the coming years, then it's likely that the current pharmacy provision at the Tesco at Roborough may not be sufficient in the future. So that's why it's important for us to know what's going on in the areas around Plymouth, rather than just focusing on Plymouth itself. So going back to our steering group, we had representatives from Plymouth City Council, Devon County Council, Torbay Council, the local pharmaceutical committee, the local medical committee, NHS England South West, and the former CCG. So if we can have the next slide, please, Elliot. One of the most important things that we produce, I think, in the PNA are the locality summaries, because as you see, there's a huge amount of information in the PNA. It runs up at about 140 pages. And what we've realised over the last 2 or 3 iterations is it's really helpful to have a summary of the key facts and figures that providers of pharmaceutical services can go to, or that NHS England can go to, just to get a very quick overview of the localities in the city, and see whether there's a gap that's been identified that they can fulfil. So what we did, we divided the city into its 4 established localities, the east, the north, the south and the west. No prizes there for novel names. And throughout the PNA, we ensured that locality-based information was presented. And what we did was in section 8, we pulled all of that together into the locality summaries, and they included the following information. So a map of the locality with the pharmacy locations, a section on demography or population size and structure, So an overview of the health needs identified in the locality, some of the best health outcomes, some of the key health needs, a section on housing growth and developments, and as I've said, that one's particularly important. Information on current pharmacy provision in terms of numbers, information on the current accessibility of pharmaceutical services, then the gap analysis section, again, particularly important. The gap analysis from the previous PNA and how that's been addressed, and then the gap analysis in the current PNA. So those locality summaries, particularly important for people to be able to get an idea of what's in the PNA in a couple of pages if they haven't got the enthusiasm to read the whole 140-page document. So if we can just move on to the next slide, please. In terms of a summary of that gap analysis, as you'll see on the next slide, ultimately what we found, there does appear to be sufficient choice with regards to obtaining pharmaceutical services in Plymouth as a whole. However, we did identify particular gaps. So there's still a need for a pharmacy in Barton, and that's really as a consequence of the deprivation and the isolation that the community of Barton is subjected to, and the lack of medical provision in the area. So there's still a gap in pharmacy provision in Barton, as there was last time. The other thing we've made clear in the PNA and in that gap analysis section is that there are extensive housing developments proposed in and around Plymouth from now until the early 2030s. I've already made reference to Woolwell. I've already made reference to Sherford, and obviously there's developments at Saltram Meadow taking place. However, most of these developments are not expected to reach a point where there's sufficient housing in terms of numbers that would identify or that would result in a gap being produced during the lifetime of this PNA. So that's not to say that when we produce the next PNA in 3 years' time, there won't be a gap that's identified. The other thing in the PNA is that we've recognised is the increasing demand pressure on primary care, and the fact that primary care provision might change significantly over the lifetime of this PNA. The other thing that we can do, I should say, is we can issue supplementary statements. So although this PNA is a statement at a point in time, if things change in the city over the lifetime of the PNA, be it in terms of pharmacy provision, be it in terms of housing provision, or for any other reason, we can issue supplementary statements to this PNA, which would also go on the Health and Wellbeing website. So if, for example, all the pharmacies on Mutley Plain, or keep with Mutley Plain as my example, if all the pharmacies on Mutley Plain closed next week, what we could do is issue a supplementary statement which says there is now a gap in pharmacy provision on Mutley Plain, and therefore pharmacy providers could come forward to address that gap. So although the PNA is fixed for 3 years, if you like, in terms of the one single big report, we can issue supplementary statements as appropriate over that 3-year timescale. So if we can just move on to the next slide, which covers the consultation, Elliot. You've got it up there, brilliant. I was looking at you and it was already there. Fantastic, you're ahead of me. So the consultation, a 60-day public consultation period ran. That ran basically July and August. That enabled stakeholders to review the PNA. A series of questions, similar to the questions we put forward last time we were at this stage. And it was also an opportunity for stakeholders to highlight anything that they thought we'd got wrong. We only received 5 responses to the consultation. Colleagues in Torbay ran their consultation at the same time. They received, I think, a fewer number of responses. Colleagues in Devon ran their consultation at the same time. They received a large number of responses, but that was really about pharmacy provision in a particular area of Devon where there have been issues. So the responses to the consultation that we had were particularly positive. The respondees said that the PNA met its requirements. The information contained within the PNA was accurate. The gaps that we identified were correct. The future gaps we'd identified were correct. And there were no gaps in provision that the consultees were aware of that are missing from this draft PNA. So that was the consultation. We move on to recommendations on the final slide. Now, I suppose what I want to check, these are the recommendations that we would propose, that the Health and Wellbeing Board accept the PNA and agree to its publication on the Health and Wellbeing Board page of the Plymouth Public Health website, so part of the wider City Council website. But I appreciate that you may want to have some conversation or discussion about the PNA, because I'm also conscious that we've got Dave Bierman here, we've got Sue Taylor online who may want to give some additional context to enable you to make that decision, and obviously give you the opportunity to ask any questions that you might have. So I'll stop there and hand it back to the chair, I guess.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you to you and your team for an excellent report and presentation today, which I think has filled in any gaps that we might have had in understanding. I mean, I have a number of questions, but I'm sure other people have questions. So who would like to go first? Mary?
Thank you, Chair. Just some basic things. It's talking about the protected characteristics, etc., and it's talking about, it says about disabilities. Does that include access into pharmacies? You know, if you think about some of them, they're off the pavement and it's quite a difficult entry. So is that covered, and is that something that, and who raises that question with a pharmacy if it's reported back about access problems? And I suppose the other thing is, if we're hearing rumours about a pharmacy, particularly in and I was going to say one of those little peninsular areas in Plymouth is threatened, that it's being threatened that that's going to close. How do we then sort of bring that onto the agenda and say this particular community needs a pharmacy in the area because of the bus service or access into it, etc.? How does that get raised within this body, or yeah?
So I'm going to answer the second one first, and then maybe my colleagues will answer your first one about access. So we've actually, myself and Carol have previously dealt with issues whereby one of the pharmacies in the city, two pharmacies wanted to merge. And so what we did, Carol and myself worked closely with the chair of the Health and Wellbeing Board. We looked at the information that the pharmacy had provided in their application to merge, therefore closing one site and putting everything onto another site. And we were able to make representation to NHS England, which showed that in our opinion it wasn't appropriate that should happen. So I suppose the point I'm making is we get the opportunity to do that because because NHS England will contact the chair of the Health and Wellbeing Board to say we've received this application from a pharmacy wanting to close or merge or change its service, and then the chair of the Health and Wellbeing Board will have the opportunity to work with us in public health and others to come up with a response to that, and we can decide whether we think it's appropriate or not and would support it or not. So there is a robust process that we go through and have gone through over the last few years. So,
Chair, we need to be making sure then that if any closures are on the horizon, that you particularly are being made aware of that, and whether we have some sort of ad hoc conversation between the four of us councillors, then I think we need to think about how that's handled, because that could quite easily happen, I think.
So Rob, access?
Yes, yeah, so certainly you and we would be made, the chair of the Health and Wellbeing Board and normally us as a public health team would be made aware of any of those issues, and certainly we as a public health team would make sure that we're proactive in liaising with yourselves as councillors and also the councillors in the area in the area affected, to make sure that we came up with a robust and appropriate response to any proposed changes.
And well, leading on from that, but Mary raised an issue about access into individual. You meant physical access into surgeries, didn't into pharmacies. Do we want to deal with that before I follow on with the supplementary to Mary's question?
Well, I'll try, but Sue may have to assist here. I can't recall exactly, Mary, so we may have to come back to you supplementary to the meeting. I do recall something many years ago about disabled access to pharmacies that was linked into the contract arrangements, but I don't think it was necessarily statutory required. But I will go back and dig through about precisely what the requirements around disabled access into pharmacies are. We'll come back to you on that. On your other point, I think you were quite right to reflect back, especially after the scrutiny discussions we had, that community pharmacy is potentially more fragile, both from a workforce perspective and from a financial perspective. So yes, it is likely to be more fluid under this period of the P&A than it has historically been. So, having a system in place to think about those supplementary arrangements, probably we need to get better at that. Pharmacies, when they go, don't necessarily give you warning because of the nature of things such as arrangements with wholesalers, etc. So, yeah, it would be useful to have some kind of process in place and thinking about that ahead, particularly regarding thinking about how we increase resilience of the system in a more broad sense. So I think you're right to raise that issue, but I will come back to you on the Form 1 on access.
Do you want to say anything, Sue, at this point?
Well, I was just going to say that they are required to make reasonable adjustments in terms of the Equality Act, but obviously it depends a lot on the actual building and where it's located and so on, and what's deemed to be a reasonable adjustment. But I think the question also asks what you would do if you wanted to raise that with a specific pharmacy. And every pharmacy has a process for patients in the public to raise concerns, etc. So initially, if anyone is experiencing difficulties in physically accessing a community pharmacy in terms of a step or a ramp or whatever it might be, would be to approach the lead pharmacist or pharmacy manager in that particular pharmacy and just ask if there's anything that can be done to support. But as David said, we'd need to go away and have a look at the actual contractual requirements for making those reasonable adjustments in terms of physical alterations to buildings.
Do you want to follow up,
No,
Mary?
if we can get that information, that would be very useful,
That's
Chair, and then we can obviously consider if there's anything that we want to follow through on that. Thank you.
But perhaps before we change subject and topic to another question, I mean, linked to this access issue is the fact that pharmacies are being asked, and it's appropriate in some cases, to offer a lot more services, particularly when GPs are seemingly under great pressure. But the issue really is that whereas GPs have, in many cases, palatial, modern, accessible surgeries, a lot of pharmacies are not. I mean, they are just, shops in shopping centres that are being converted, been running many years as a pharmacy, and they don't perhaps have the facilities or the scope, which brings us to the issue that actually pharmacies being asked to do a lot more work, but does it really have the resources in terms of property, facilities, space, which I don't think it does, and also does it have resilience in numbers of staff to do all these extra functions? I mean, GPs may be under pressure, but they do have a plethora of different health professionals working in their surgeries now, whereas I get the impression that pharmacies are running on a max of 2 or 3 people in the building at one time. So, I mean, what is the news on that?
Yeah, Chair, it is reasonable to say that workforce pressures in the South West are significant. There is some workforce planning activity going on. We are working with Health Education England around how we develop the workforce we've currently got. We're looking to potentially provide support around independent prescribing, training, etc. and also looking to bring in some more techs, etc., into the area. There is some long-term work going on as well regarding trying to increase the number of pharmacists into the area. It is under pressure. However, we also are looking to what we can do around technology in terms of providing some of those dispensing services in an off-site way to increase our capacity. And it is fundamental to pharmacies' resilience around their actual finances to make sure that we do deliver increased numbers of services. So we very much will focus on ensuring that we can do that, because it is critical to the long-term resilience of the pharmacy chain that we do. I'm not suggesting that things are easy, they're not. However, I think you'll find that pharmacies are very much trying to do everything they possibly can to provide the appropriate services to patients. So I would just say that we do need to ensure that we do drive services as far as we possibly can, because it is a fundamental requirement in that, and that helps with the finances. That therefore helps with the ability to recruit and retain staff as well. So that's very much our focus, is to drive services and to support our pharmacists as far as we can in delivering excellent services to the patients.
Thank you, Dave. I mean, I think
Sure.
pharmacists have been, so I'll come back to you, but I think pharmacists have been providing a lot of extra advice over the pandemic and probably since. But again, of course, you know, if you are disabled, you might not be able to access the pharmacist very easily because a lot of their premises are not suitable. Sue, did you want to say something more?
I was just going to say about the premises. So I just wanted to remind the board that community pharmacies are regulated under the General Pharmaceutical Council. So they do have to meet certain specifications and requirements in terms of how they're laid out and the size, and also they have to have consultation rooms. So that's a requirement of their core contract, that they have consultation rooms so that they can have a private conversation with their patients around the services as well.
Can I just add as well that certainly where I've been, if there are steps, they're quite often aluminium ramps or something sitting in the practice. That, as Sue says, though, it will depend on the location, and there may be other mechanisms by which they ensure access. But we will go back and clarify, and we would hope that the great majority of pharmacists have a mechanism, if not all actually, have a mechanism for ensuring that people who are disabled can get access into the unit. But we will clarify precisely what that is.
Okay, thank you, both of you, for those responses. Cathy Watkin.
Thank you, Chair. I've got two main concerns about pharmacies. First of all, I'm concerned that people go in there for advice and they're giving second-rate advice than they would if they went to see a GP. And secondly, I'm also concerned at how these finances are going to be dealt with. Presumably, if the pharmacy is producing services, then the money will go from somewhere else, or else is there an extra pot of money that's going to be for providing the services to the pharmacy? I mean, basically, pharmacies are commercial enterprises, but clearly there's some money coming from the NHS to go to them.
So what's basically happened is that the pharmacy contract, I think it was 2018 or 2019, basically was a contract in which the pharmacy services were built into the contract, and the funding for them came out of a reduction in the actual remuneration for providing supply. So basically the services that are being delivered through the pharmacy are effectively being delivered within the same cost envelope as historically was, and there's been no inflationary uplift. So this is why actually community pharmacy is under severe financial pressures at this point in time. But so the actual funding for delivering a service at local level comes from that national pot that has been drawn back from the supply by community pharmacy. So it is very much in the interests of local health systems to utilise those pharmacy services as far as possible, because it comes out of the national financial pot as opposed to the local one. You know, that the situation from a pharmacy perspective is effectively we're delivering those at the same total cost base as we were doing many years ago. So that there isn't really a financial implication to the NHS. In fact, it's a very positive thing from the NHS perspective. May not be quite as positive from a community pharmacy perspective. But so in terms of the actual education and support, obviously we are registered professionals. The situation is that when we undergo new services that they're outside the current understanding, we would expect to go through appropriate training. We're increasingly working with HE in the training hub to try and make sure that training is the same training as you would do with a nurse or a GP or whatever. We're trying to support joint training initiatives. But you have to remember an awful lot of what is going on within the things we talk about, GP, CPCS, etc. They're minor ailment schemes that we have been doing for many, many years. They're not necessarily new conditions that we're dealing with. We're just trying to offload the conditions that we've been dealing with for many, many years from the GP surgery, so they don't clog up appointment base. If you have examples where you're concerned about the level of things, but please let me know. We haven't seen that in particular, but if you've got some anecdotes you wish to share, then by all means look at those for you.
Well, I can actually share an anecdote. I went into a pharmacy and I gave my symptoms to the assistant at the front.
Mm-hmm.
She obviously relayed them to the person behind, who typed them out on a computer, came up with a product, which is probably the most expensive product available, handed it to me. I took it, obviously paid for it, and I thought, well, actually, this doesn't really relate to the symptoms I actually gave in the first place. It was
So,
okay. I wasn't adversely affected by it.
I'll take that
you know,
offline with you. But generally, okay. But generally, I'm not aware that that's a significant issue. But if it obviously we would look at that where that arises.
But of course, to follow on from that, there are people now who are consulting pharmacists about issues that they probably should be seeing their GP or another health professional. And again, it brings us back to if you don't see a GP and you don't have a face-to-face consultation, a lot of issues don't come out over the telephone, and because they're not being dealt with in the way that most patients would seem expeditiously appropriate or in the correct manner, face to face. A lot of people are going to pharmacists, which undoubtedly I talked to my pharmacist last night when I picked up a prescription, and the number of inquiries and general matters she deals with, not just things for which there are extra payments, maybe like family planning or vaccination, that sort of stuff. The number of inquiries she's had straight through, from COVID right through when GPs shut up their doors, has continued. So, I mean, they are being asked a lot more requests for health information, and I'm sure most of the advice is very good, but because they're being asked more, the pressures are increasing, and of course from time to time things won't go as they should, and part of this is because people are, I'm sure, perhaps you would know more, resorting to consulting with their pharmacists rather than waiting for hours on the telephone or doing an e-consult or trying to get to see a GP that they don't think they'll be able to see in the end. I mean, is this becoming an increasing problem?
I wouldn't regard it as a problem because it's part of our role, but the volume and acuity of patients we're seeing is increasing. Yes, John, that's correct. And the key issue for us is ensuring that we have a sustainable position in terms of funding and workforce, and to make that a resilient outcome for everybody. And that's the thing we're facing into, is to try and ensure that that is the case.
Thank you. I mean, you are the front door of the NHS in many ways now. You can just walk into a pharmacy, which is much more than you can do with any other service. Yes, Sue.
Thank you, Chair. Given the demographic trend for ageing is rising, sorry.
Sorry, people are not particularly speaking into the mic, so
All right.
Can
you hear me now?
It's difficult to hear. Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. Thanks. I was thinking about the demographic trend for ageing. and it's likely to increase, it follows, I think, that the more elderly people you have, the more likely they are to experience illness and require the services. So I wonder if we're future-proofing in order to cope, because it's very rare that you get young people, sadly it might be, you know, the few, but it's very rare that fit, young, healthy people require these services. But as you get older, they will do. And I don't know what's happening or what's being planned for that, quite a spike, and longevity too, added to that. So it's not so much about living longer, it's about the quality of life that you have while you are living to an older age. And are we prepared for that?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a valid point, aging population and changing patterns. But I suppose my initial thought on that is that although that's happening, it won't happen overnight. So we are having an aging population, but it won't be that one week we've got a younger population. So my thought, and the pharmacy professionals can correct me if I'm wrong, is that what will happen is that pharmacies will evolve to respond to that as it happens, because it's not going to be a sudden shift. It's going to be an evolve. The population ages gradually. So in terms of the services they provide and the products that they stock, I guess, then there'll be a shift over time in that as the population ages. So I suppose what I'm saying is that pharmacy will respond in parallel with the aging population, because they will see different, the nature of people coming through the door will slowly change over time. That would be my thought on that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Craig.
Thanks, Chair. Couple of questions. Firstly, I think it is a really comprehensive report, so thank you particularly to Carol in the cheap seats, as Rob says, and I'll speak into the mic, Mary. Two issues for me, really. One is around the consultation. So the consultation did feel comprehensive, but the number of responses we got back were quite low, I think, 5, I think, or something like that, although Health Watch responded, which is really good. So I just wondered how that benchmarked to other consultations we've done in previous years, Rob, in particular, and whether that's in line with expectations, because it looks low, but it might be high. I genuinely don't know. And then my second point is, it's disappointing to read again that Barton isn't still served as well. So we've produced these needs assessments, which shows a gap, and then we do them again and there's still a gap. So is there any advice you probably could give to us as a board about how we can use this document to really lever change within that particular area?
Okay, so in terms of the consultation, I think last time we did it 3 years ago, we had 1 additional response. So I think we're only 1 down on this time. But I think the thing to bear in mind with the consultation is it's a targeted, focused consultation. It's not a public consultation. We're not going out to the general public about the PNA. It's more a targeted consultation. So I think Torbay had 4 responses this year, I think. And as I say, it was only Devon who had over 100, but that was because there's a particular issue in North Devon which a lot of their parish councillors are involved in. So there was probably the PNA's out to consultation, don't you? Sort of but no, I mean I think it was, the comments that we had back were positive. It is disappointing when you get a small number of responses, but it was similar to last time, really. Yeah, the issue in Barton, as you say, there is still a gap there. I think since, as a result of the last PNA, when a gap was identified, I think 2 pharmacy providers did come forward wanting to provide a pharmacy in Barton, and I think they put in an application to NHS England, which NHS England approved. But I think that but I think the application lapsed before anything was put in place. So I think what we've got to continue to do, I guess, as a health and wellbeing board and as a health system is highlight the issues that are faced in Barnbarton by the residents of the area, because those of us who know Barnbarton well know that it's a bit of a trek from the top of Barnbarton down to St Budo Square and back up again. So yeah, I think all we can do is keep highlighting that and keep encouraging NHS England to seek provision in that area. I don't know if Dave wants to say a bit more.
Yeah, regarding Barnbarton, the issue is one of financial viability, and therefore, the reality is that numerous people have looked at it, put in applications, done a more detailed assessment, realising that actually that they just cannot make it viable. So the reality is within an existing contractual framework, it would be quite difficult to see how that would come about, particularly as finances are now even tighter than they were at the time. So it would require something a bit novel there in order to make that work. So potentially something involve more health service, etc. Now, that is potentially possible, but it would need to be considered about how that would fit within the health hub type arrangements that we're doing elsewhere in the city. So I think that requires a bit more creative thinking if we're going to solve that one, to be honest with you.
Mary.
I think what we've got here is, as Craig said, it's a good report, and I think we need to be building on it. And I think one of those things that bothers me is pharmacies have to be economically viable, and else a contractor is going to pull out. And I suppose we're seeing more large organisations running them rather than little pharmacies on the corner that are independent, if you want to call it that way. So I do think it's quite interesting as to how we engage the larger pharmacies, the larger companies, to say, okay, we need somewhere like Barnbarton serviced. How can you do it within your franchise or whatever you want, whatever it's classed as? How can we do it so that the community is served? I mean, it's working with social housing, isn't it, providers as well, to see, is there something that can be done? And maybe it's a case of a pharmacy in somewhere like Barnbarton is open, say, 2 days a week, but we know there's somewhere like a community hub that would be able to service them. And coming back to what advice, etc., pharmacists are being asked to give, we all know that the logarithms with a computer system doesn't always work, as Kathy found out. But I think my other concern, and Sarah will be talking about mental health provision, is I don't know how we gauge what advice pharmacists are being asked to provide for people. But I would have thought, if they don't know the latest up-to-date things on whether it's mental health, whether it's on pregnancy and whatever, then there could be a problem. And that's, so again, it comes back to, how do pharmacists and their assistants get the training that they need? And is that something within the pharmaceutical needs assessment that we need to be making sure that we have a statement saying up-to-date training is essential if this is going to be provided by pharmacists? And how do we get that envelope of finance from someone to make sure that that is happening? Because pharmacists are a very, very, very good community resource, and we do need to be making sure the envelope of money is there.
So two things. It might be worth reminding Health and Wellbeing Board as well that pharmacies are quite a critical part of the high street in terms of the economic viability of the high street. So they serve more than just a health purpose. They're also quite an economic purpose in terms of the health of the city. But in terms of the training, we do CPD, as all health professions do. The multiples and others have structured training programs that people go through, and there is expectations of people each year to keep up to date. Certainly when new things are introduced, there will be a training regime around them, and people will have undergone a training package to ensure that they're able to deliver a service correctly. You know, I don't think we're anything different to any other profession. We're probably a bell curve of capability, as all are. And, you know, I believe in terms of the overall interventions we generally provide a very good service. I'm not aware of this algorithm piece, so it'd be really interesting to find out more about that from you at some point, Kathy, if that's okay, to understand where that's occurring. So I would hope, Mary, that you know that the training levels are of a good standard, and certainly you know we do as well work through the Devon Training Hub to link into some of their training and education programs as well. So you know, in terms of consistency, that's quite difficult to be assured of across a range of different providers, as it is, you know, within general practice or any others. But you know, there are required standards by the GPHC around training and education and delivery, and professional standards. So we would expect people to stay up to date with their knowledge.
And I think that's one of those things that we have to bear in mind, that people have to have time to do training, and that again puts more pressure on somebody, you know, on a pharmacy. So I think that's, you know, that needs to be, I'm not saying we put it in here, but I think it's something that we all need to be very much aware of.
Thank you. But going back to the issue of Barton, where for years we've heard about needs for, you know, more dental access across the city, but Barton has featured in that, and I know there have been attempts to create a dental surgery there. Perhaps GP surgeries were talked about at one point for Barton. Well, actually in St Buda, the two have amalgamated, so the chance of having a branch in Barton is not that good, but there is more building going on in Barton. And come back to the question of how much pressure or whatever do NHS England, how proactive are NHS England in any of these fields, be it dentistry or pharmacy, in actually trying to solve the problem and linking it to the fact that, you know, the report says that in certain parts of the city there aren't perhaps sufficient pharmacies available at weekends, on Saturdays and Sundays. What can NHS England do, and what do they do to try and encourage an existing pharmacy to stay open a bit longer? Now, in general practice, there's extra money for extended hours and things like that. So surely, you know, people can think outside the box and create some way where there could be an incentive for extra hours in certain pharmacies, and possibly even extending to someone having a branch pharmacy in Barton for, you know, as Mary said, 2 days a week. So how proactive is NHS England, and what pressure could we bring upon them?
Can I chip in here?
So yes, Carrie.
Oh, yeah, okay. So NHS England don't tend to be proactive in terms of inviting people to put in applications for community pharmacies, unless there is a mechanism called local pharmaceutical service, which I believe was carried out some time ago in a part of Plymouth, but I'm not sure. I don't think it still exists, but they can work with the local system and contract with a pharmacy contractor to provide local pharmaceutical services, which tend to be, as David said earlier, it might need to be something a bit different and novel compared to the core pharmacy contract at the moment. But there is a mechanism to do that. With the commissioning of pharmaceutical services is being devolved down to the ICBs from the 1st of April, and there might be more scope then when the ICB has more commissioning responsibilities around community pharmacy, but also in terms of maybe a pharmacy just being open for a couple of days. They are the core contractual requirements state that a pharmacy has to be open for a minimum of 40 hours a week. And I don't think it would be possible for NHS England to approve an application for a pharmacy that was only going to be open, for example, for 15 to 20 hours a week, because that sits outside the regulations for pharmacy contract. But a local pharmaceutical service might be a possibility. I don't know what David's thoughts are on that for Barnbarton.
Yeah, that is a potential, and you're right in saying when things have evolved, it may offer us more opportunity. But that obviously will be up to the ICS, ICB to look into that in due course. The other thing just to raise is that if there is opening hour issues, there is always the opportunity for NHSE to offer rotas, etc., to close that gap. But they're normally used in periods of bank holidays, etc. But historically, they have been utilised on Sundays and other areas. So if the provision got to the point whereby it was significantly short, and I have to say, unfortunately, hours are generally reducing rather than increasing at this point in time. But that then may come back into play, as rotas was something that used to be in activity quite significantly many years ago, but they largely disappeared with the advent of 100-hour contracts, etc., in urban areas. So we may see the trend reversing in that regard. And your comment as well, Mary, about multiples spreading, in fact, that probably trend is stopped, and it may even be reversing. So yet to be definitively the case, but certainly we're not seeing as much multiple expansion as we historically have, and we are seeing divestment of some multiple premises to actually local independence these days.
Thank you for those contributions. So we might hope that the ICB might be more proactive in some of these areas, dentistry and pharmacy, than NHS England seems to have been. We can only hope, can't we, Mary?
I'm not saying anything, Chair.
Well, I've said it. Are there any other questions? Well, we need... Now, I've lost...
Yes, Chair. So we've got two recommendations before us. The first one is to formally accept the Plymouth Pharmaceutical Needs Assessment for 2022 to 25. And the second one is to agree to its publication on the Health and Wellbeing Board page of the website.
Do we also need to put in the recommendation that should there be any change to pharmacy provision within our communities, that something that is brought, that information is shared with the chair, so that the committee might, I mean, you need to think about how we phrase it, that the chair shares it with us. Yeah.
Maybe it should be shared initially with the chair of the Health and Wellbeing Board and the chair of the Health and Overview Scrutiny Panel.
That sounds good to me.
Can we add that in? Is that reasonable? Yeah. Can I just confirm your wording on that one? It should there be any changes to the pharmacy provision, health and wellbeing, and health and adult social care?
And the health and scrutiny panel chair should be informed. Okay, is everyone happy? Show of hands, we support those three recommendations. Okay. And I'd like to thank everyone involved in the production of this report. I shall certainly be filing it because it gives a good overview about health and health inequalities and issues across the city, other than just ones related to the pharmaceutical business. So thank you for the report, which probably a good thing it's only produced once every 3 or 5 years. There's a lot of work involved and a lot of paper. So thank you very much. And we will now answer the questions that people have asked. We will now move on to mental health services during and post-COVID. And Sarah Mitchell, you're going to deliver a presentation.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
So LiveWell were asked if we could come and talk about, I mean, this item's been on the agenda for quite a long time, so it almost feels like the world has moved on to some degree. But the title was, the question was, how citizens with learning disability and serious and enduring mental illness have fared during COVID, and the projected increases in demand for mental health services linked to the economy and post-COVID. So that was the title we were given, and I was thinking, well, how can we answer this really in any sort of meaningful way? So I thought that what I'd do is just talk a little bit initially about services and the experiences of COVID and what happened during COVID. And then, because we are sometime later on now looking at the demand, the current demand in mental health services and our current position. So I hope you find the presentation interesting. So I think it's really important to say that during the total of the pandemic, no services were stood down. So we didn't stand any mental health service down or any learning disability service down. And bearing in mind, Live Well South West provides around 40 different mental health services and about 10 or 12 different learning disabilities in total. So none of those services were stood down. And I think that it's really probably helpful for you to say that everybody on caseloads that were known to services were all individually risk assessed, which was quite a time-consuming piece of work. That started in April 20, the first year of the pandemic, to make sure that we were able to, with the intention of not standing down any services, any offers, but to make sure that people were receiving the most appropriate offers. So what I mean by that is that we knew that some people, for example, in community mental health services, may prefer to be seen on a video link rather than coming into a building face to face, which we were obviously trying to minimise. So we started giving people options, more options than we had done previously. So no services were stood down. And in fact, and I am going to come on to this at the end because I think this is really interesting in terms of the data, but what we actually did during COVID, we actually stood up a number of services and started a number of services. So our first response line, crisis line, is for anybody with a self-perceived crisis. And that is very much an individual perceived crisis. And that's a 24-hour line, which initiated in the 1st of May 2020. So that's one service we stood up. For people that are familiar with the work that we've been doing with primary care over the last few years, we also expanded our primary care offer as well and rolled that out. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that at the end because that's really come on leaps and bounds. So we absolutely stood up that service with the intention of trying to offer people during COVID and during the pandemic something exceptional, which would mean that their mental health wouldn't escalate. And then also, useful to, just to add, you probably remember that our joint response unit with the police, so the police with Live Well with an approved mental health practitioner or a social worker, was also maintained all during COVID. So we worked with the police to make sure that offer was maintained. And the police were very much in favour of continuing to work in partnership, and indeed we still do. And then also during the pandemic, I'm still on the first slide. We opened up our alternative to ED, which is an alternative to keep people away from the front door of the emergency department. And I'm going to come back to that at the end as well, if that's okay, because I think it just gives people an understanding of where we are and how we're progressing. So that was just something really to set the context, to say that our services ran as per normal. People using our services were very much supported, carers were supported, and it was challenging, as you can imagine, with the levels of sickness with staff, but that was something we managed to achieve. So just moving on to the next slide, there's something, so I'm going to start talking specifically about learning disabilities first, because I think I know this board are very much well aware of the differences between people with learning disabilities and mental health problems, but I think it is really important to point out that those services within Live Well South West are totally different. So the only similarity is that they sit within the same directorate. They are a completely different set of services. So and obviously a different team. So COVID and learning disabilities. So what we know was that in the first wave of the pandemic, there was four deaths across the whole of Devon, and 2 of those were people known to Plymouth services, both in residential homes. And that seemed to be very much of a trend through that first part of the pandemic, that the deaths were occurring in residential homes. And it was thought that, I mean, analysis of the data, and I don't think this will come as a surprise, but people think it's because in residential homes, people are much more closely together. There was very poor PPE, protective equipment, particularly in the first wave, as you'll be very familiar with. Access to testing for people with learning disabilities was challenging. And I think we saw that consistently on the media, on the television every night. And I think that was something we very much experienced. And I think at the time, carers, family members were left really not knowing what to do in terms of when people were deteriorating. Because I think it must be noted that people with a learning disability are potentially 6 times more likely to die from COVID during the pandemic than the rest of the population. And not to go through the reasons why, but you will see them on the slide, and it's about physical health related problems such as diabetes, the prevalence of heart conditions, and morbid obesity, just to name but 3. So there was definitely something that we needed to do differently and something that we needed to learn from. So the next slide just talks really through about what we did. So what did we do in learning disabilities? So there was particularly in Plymouth, there was something called a Restore 2 programme, which was training carers, a lot of carers, over 100 in fact, in terms of being able to identify when people were deteriorating. And that was deteriorating in relation to COVID, deteriorating in relation to physical health generally, and just being aware of people's health and well-being in a way that probably wasn't previously in place. The annual health check work continued. I think it's true to say that at times it varied due to the ability to be able to carry out those health checks, but it was something that very much at the end of the first wave were picked up and put back into place with primary care where that was appropriate. Vaccinations were very much promoted during that time. And that really helped to create a collaborative way of working with the primary care networks. And there was also the setting up of learning disability champions, and that was really around reducing health inequalities and improving reasonable adjustments to access healthcare. And I think particularly within Plymouth, we are very good at sort of access now, far better than previously, but it was really to promote the understanding of the needs of people with learning disabilities. So I think it's also, next slide, it's also really useful to say that for people's information that so we're moving on slightly now, in July 21, we also set up our autism service. So people with learning disabilities often have a co-presentation of autism. So the autism service has been very, very proactive in trying to engage with people with learning disabilities and that service. In fact, it actually sits within that service. And we now have 2 parts to it. We have a diagnosis autism service and then also a follow-up and support service, which has been a fantastic opportunity. We're also in the process of setting up a learning disability partnership. There is one via the system within the ICS, within the integrated care system, and we're also in the process of setting up a local one and continuing to work with the LD champions. So I'm just going now to take you on to something about the demand in mental health. So I'm going back to mental health now to talk about the demand. So I'm sure you'll have seen the data. So I think it's really interesting for a number of reasons, which unless you're familiar with the services, you may not be aware of. So I'm going to go back to where we started at the beginning. So the services that we set up during the pandemic. So the first response team, which is that self-perceived crisis line for people to ring up and call. There's no referral system. People just ring up and a call is answered 24 hours of the day. So what we've seen is that service has become a very well utilised service. Currently, we average about 90 calls in a 24-hour period today. So I think that has really influenced the data in terms of the demand for mental health services. Our primary care mental health team, which now in sort of September 22, the end of September, we are in a really positive position with primary care. So we're working across all of the PCNs within the community mental health framework. We have implemented our mental health R's roles, or additional responsibility roles in mental health. We have 8 emotional regulators. Have the Community Mental Health Framework Devon Alliance, so we have the VCSE working directly with us. That's very new. So the primary care mental health team has really prevented people from escalating to those traditional secondary care services, which has meant that you probably remember that back in 2000, year and a half. So what we've seen in the data is that the traditional services, such as the community mental health services, have really seen a significant decrease. Now, that's not just purely by coincidence. Our vision was, our strategy was that implementing services at primary care with our GP colleagues would not only help and support GPs, but it would also prevent people going to secondary care. And I think that we have been, in our approach, we are able to provide a very bespoke offer for everybody, for all people. So it's not just a standard offer, it's very much based on individual need. And we have got rid of the term of referral. People are not referred. People come into the service with a presentation and are then seen and triaged and the best options. You know, we were told all the way through pandemic that we'd see a vast increase in numbers of people into those services. We haven't seen that. So what we have seen, though, is the presentation of people who are more unwell. So it's required us to really rejig our workforce into a higher level of practitioners, which we're doing within the system with Devon Partnership Trust colleagues. So when you look at the data, you will think, well, actually, the demand has gone up significantly. Suggesting that the reason for that is because of the first response service, which is a phone line which does skew the numbers, and also the implementation of primary care. Okay. Oh, okay. Sorry.
Apologies about that.
Did you catch the bit about first response and primary care? Yeah, okay. So I think that's what, well, I know that's what makes the demand look greater. So if you look at the first data slide, you can see that from the beginning of the pandemic until now, our referrals superficially have gone from 15,000 to 25,000. The last section on your right-hand side is a 6-month period only, so that's from March to August 22. I apologise if it's small. But you can see that the number of referrals to first response is very high, which we'd want it to be. And I'd also like to point out, while we've got the opportunity, that we're doing a lot of work with our emergency department colleagues, and our offer of group work and with our frequent users now extends to ED. So we have a pathway straight from ED into primary care mental health. So that's something that's very, very new. It's over the last 6 weeks we've started that, and very, very optimistic that will give a really good offer for people who frequently attend ED because of the level of moderate mental health distress that they experience. So that's all referrals. Now the next slide, and I just really wanted to bring this to your attention because I think it just demonstrates that, and once again, it's slightly skewed by the fact that you can't not be accepted if you contact the first response team because it's a telephone line. But the number of referrals accepted now compared to pre-pandemic is significantly higher. So we've got here the numbers of 23,000 are now accepted compared to 12,500. Now, as I say, I think I wanted to bring this along just to show you how much more flexible we are with our mental health services, but I am mindful that with primary care and the first response team, it does, as I say, slightly skew things. So that's really, and you'll also see if you look at the data that the numbers going into the traditional community mental health teams have significantly reduced, and we truly believe that's because of the additional offers we have. Our alternative to ED is working very well. It works well with our police colleagues in terms of tying it together in our mental health urgent care pathway. And our alternative to ED, we do have a long-term vision about. It would be really nice to get the funding at some point in time to actually prevent people with a mental health problem, unless they need to be in ED, ever going to ED. So that's like a vision I'm hoping to aspire to in the next few years, but with colleagues. But we are running up to a 6th night now, so we are offering a 6th night service, which 2 years ago we didn't have any service at all. So that's just something about demand. And the last slide just once again shows you the amounts of referrals accepted compared to those that had been pre-pandemic. And so I think, just really to finish, I think the moving forward in the future working, I think it's really exciting. So our primary care offer will grow, and we are our next project, once we have implemented the community mental health framework, as business as usual. So that primary care offer is to expand into some exercise and gym work for people, as well as a multi-mental health offer. It's very, very exciting. Doing some more work with carers, and we've just employed a peer support worker specifically for carers. I'm not aware of another one of those roles, so that's something we've done together. Our physical health check numbers are good, both in terms of mental health and learning disabilities. It's a slightly different approach, but within mental health services, they are done as part of people's regular review. And our current, within 12 months, because that's when they have to be completed with people with a severe and enduring mental illness, is about 72%. The discrepancy is that some people take a lot of engagement to get into appointments. And we will continue to work with primary care. And I think if I was to be asked which is one of our greatest successes within the last couple of years, it would have to be our work with primary care and the way that the relationships have changed. And we've got collecting a portfolio of some really, really positive stories of people's journeys through that team. And that really brings us up to our position today.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And it's encouraging. It's probably the first pieces of good news we've heard for a long while coming on the mental health front. That's particularly welcome. And it would appear that whether COVID has actually concentrated yours and other people's minds to alter the service and improve it, or whether it was happening anyway, which I suspect it was, at least we seem now to have a better service in mental health terms than we did, despite the ravages of COVID. Can I just ask, what is the out-of-hours first response team at night? Did you touch on that? What hours do they work?
24/7. It's 24 hours. Yeah.
7 days a week.
7 days a week.
Okay, thank you. Mary.
One of the things that I think, well, anecdotally noted is young children, sort of the ones that are now going to school now, having had 2 years of social isolation because parents weren't letting them go out and play, things like that. Are you seeing early referrals to CAMHS rising because children just aren't, I suppose socially, it's that school ready, isn't it? Whether, it's mixing. I mean, as I say, anecdotally, just from talking to people, how children, I'm not saying all children bound to meet people and are bubbly and whatever immediately. I mean, there's always been the shy ones and whatever, but have you seen sort of a rise in those referrals?
We have, and today I've particularly sort of focused on adults, but we have, Mary, and I think it seems to be that the whole sort of journey through COVID has had a really detrimental effect on quite young children. So supporting to schools rather than sort of just bringing people into CAMS is absolutely crucial. And also in the community mental health framework, there's also an offer for young people, so from 16 onwards, trying once again to prevent people going into secondary care, because we don't really want people going into secondary care. But yes, we have. We have also joined our adult first response line with what was the previous crisis line for children. So it's an ageless first response line we have now. So there is an option for children and young people, children of any age, to call that number and receive support and advice.
Knowing how 5-year-olds use phones.
Yeah, yeah.
But I suppose really what I want to understand a little bit more is academies can do what they want, and if they want to pay for a psychologist or a support worker to come in, they will do. But some, let's say, may not be as enlightened as others. So I just wonder how we can find out what the situation is across the board for, say, every young child within, and what sort of access they've got to something like that.
I mean, it might be helpful, and maybe not for today, but it might be helpful if children's and young people's colleagues come and talk you through that in terms of the support they're having, and to break that down into schools and areas and localities, and because I think that in itself is a topic of its own, really, because there are different levels of support going into various schools and academies and colleges and universities. So.
Elliot, I think that's something that, and Chair, that I'd certainly want put on the health scrutiny agenda. I think sometimes that, to me, that's essential, and obviously inviting anybody from the children's scrutiny to come along as well and input into that.
Yeah, we'll pick that up outside this meeting.
Thank you, Mary. Kathy.
Thank you, Chair. I've just got a query about the data on the last item from March to August 22. You've got 387 asylum seekers.
That's correct.
And I mean, I understand from Plymouth City website, there's only a total of about 350 in the whole of Plymouth. So why have all the asylum seekers been referred?
So we have an asylum seeker team, so that's related to the actual team themselves.
Right.
We have a separate team for asylum seekers.
So all the asylum seekers get referred?
Yes, if they require mental health input and general social support, yes.
But presumably they all did. I mean, the total number in Plymouth, I understand, is about 350. So 387 got referred, then the whole of the asylum seeking population of Plymouth got referred.
Yeah, that wouldn't be unusual. Plus the fact it will also take, so these are just people coming into service, so it will be anybody of that group that may already live in Plymouth as well. So it won't necessarily just be people coming in new into Plymouth.
So
it might,
on the next data, they might not be so many. So it's a collective amount.
correct.
No,
Yeah,
put in. Yeah.
it is.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Sue.
Thank you, Chair. I'm interested in the role of the mental health commissioners, and I wonder, I don't know very much about them, but do they come and assess what you're doing?
So they don't come and assess, we work collaboratively with them. So the community mental health framework, we have worked hand in hand really with mental health commissioners as was in terms of implementing the programme right across Devon. The model in Plymouth is slightly different because it is more advanced, and we had already started working with primary care back in 2018. So we are more advanced, but yes, we work with commissioners on everything we do. And I think our model in Plymouth is seen as that of a really excellent model nationally as well, because we also meet with NHSE colleagues, both regional and national. And we've been asked to sort of talk about our model in Plymouth at a number of events, both in terms of our physical health check for people with SMI approach, and also our community mental health framework approach. So yes, we always work with commissioners, but fortunately we have enough autonomy, if you like, to mould our model as we want it to be.
Thank you. Is that a public document, with all due regard to confidentiality?
Is this a public document?
No. What
Oh,
the
oh.
Mental Health Commissioners write about, say, your service? Is that in the public domain, with all due care and attention to not disclosing the patient's name?
So that they don't see the commission report on Live Well, and we are actually, the last one was 2019. So we are actually due for a report either the end of this year and a large visit, or the beginning of next year.
I see. So the commissioners merely visit.
So the commissioners is more of a day-to-day working relationship of setting the scene, working together in terms of implementing. We work basically to deliver the long-term plan within mental health, and our CCG, our commissioning colleagues with ourselves and Devon Partnership Trust work together to determine what the priorities are, how we're going to deliver those, and more recently in mental health, a provider collaborative has been introduced since the 1st of April. So that's a changing commissioning role into the ICB, and that's really still to be determined at the moment. But yes, the commissioning function as it was, DPT and ourselves all work together to determine what we will be delivering and how that looks.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the reply. Are there any other questions? No? Thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
coming along, and I think the news you're transmitting to us is somewhat encouraging.
Thank
Obviously,
you.
there is more demand, but you are coping with it in a timely fashion, it would appear. So
Thank you.
Thank you very much to you and your colleagues. I was going to say, shall we have a 5-minute or 7-minute comfort break? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for reassembling. I think we're all happy and comfortable now. So we will go on to agenda item 9, cost of living update and citizens' advice. And Rachel Silcock is going to deliver an update first. Thank you, Rachel.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So just as context, the City Council has set up a cost of living task force, which met for the first time a couple of weeks ago, and it builds really on the strengths of our existing partnerships. So the task force includes organisations like Citizens Advice, who are here today, Plymouth Energy Community, Food Plymouth, the churches, Community Connections from the City Council, and other organisations such as Plymouth Argyle. So we have a cost of living task force already looking at this issue. These slides that I'm presenting today were prepared for the task force, and we thought it would be good to share with the Health and Wellbeing Board, and we'll talk a bit about the health implications of the cost of living situation. So yes, next slide, please. So just a bit, so the background to this, as everybody's I'm sure aware, that so the economic downturn as well as the impact of COVID-19 and the increases of cost of living have obviously encouraged us to have a renewed focus on this issue in terms of things like such as debt, poverty, and promoting financial wellbeing in the city. The cost of financial exclusion is high both to households affected and to society in general, and it impacts on general wellbeing. But I would say that our colleagues from Citizens Advice are going to talk about this in much more detail, so I won't dwell on that. They're going to go into the impact on people that they're seeing in their service. Thanks. Next slide. So the aims of our city response is that, as I say, we will be working together with partners, with all those specialist agencies and stakeholders to look at how we can deliver our supportive financial inclusion services. A lot of work, and as I'll talk about in a minute, a lot of work is already happening. You know, there's lots of work that's been ongoing for many years. This is not necessarily a new response, but we are obviously having a renewed focus on this. We'll be providing joined up multi-agency offers so that we can improve and increase access to advice for residents facing financial hardship. And there'll be key messages and comms, making sure that we promote the awareness of those services, improving access to and signposting to any new, well, existing and new services. Thanks. Next slide. So in terms of who's at risk, obviously there's lots of information and data on this, and again I think this will be covered quite well by citizens' advice really, but you know, there are obviously deprivation affects several groups in our society, and those people particularly affected are groups such as obviously households on low income and in social housing and on benefits, homeless or vulnerably housed, single parents and single person households, older people, also younger people, people with disabilities, including serious mental illness, and also households where there's been a significant and unexpected event which has had an impact on their income. So obviously things like losing work, and we saw some of this impact during the COVID pandemic when people were getting ill and as well. So obviously, as we know, as the cost of living increases, so that reduces people's disposable income, and it means that people are having to make choices around heating, eating and paying debts. Thanks. Next slide. So clearly there are multiple impacts, and poverty, as we know, is a strong determinant of health and well-being, and it affects many areas of life. And even a relatively short-term period over the winter will have an impact on people's finances, especially if people get into debt. And in terms of impacts on health and well-being, so cold homes bring us a significant increased risk of hospitalisation for people, especially with people with existing conditions such as cardiovascular, respiratory and circulatory problems. And then health issues caused by cold and damp also impact on children, exacerbating the impacts such as asthma and increasing the severity of viral and bacterial infections. And then, of course, the food issue around poor nutrition, so food that's cheap and gives people instant energy, can often be also unhealthy, which can lead to poor nutrition. So in addition to that, of course, then you've got the stress and worry that people will have, which will have a further negative impact on health. Thank you. Next slide. So Plymouth, as a city, we already adopt very much a joined-up approach to this. We take a system leadership approach, which means that we're working with all of those leaders in the system who have an impact on people's cost of living and ability to afford food and energy, etc. And so many of the approaches that we need to support people through this challenge are already in place to some extent. So we've given some examples here. We've got a series of wellbeing hubs, 6 across the city, which provide advice and information and lots of other support, such as mental health support. We have the Complex Lives Alliance, which provides support to people who face homelessness and also substance misuse and mental health issues. Plymouth Energy Community, who advise on energy. Food Plymouth, who are providing doing lots of work around the coordination of food aid and food supply. They're also looking at new models of food supply around, for example, social supermarkets. We're looking at social supermarket models, looking at food co-ops, looking at community larders. So there's lots of work already going on. So I want to emphasise really on this issue, but we're obviously going to bring in all that together through our task force. And we have on the Plymouth Online Directory a cost of living page, which actually also comes up on the front page of the council's website. So if you go on the council's website, you'll see cost of living. It takes you straight through to the online directory. And we will be adding and improving that information as we go along, but it is there. Thanks. So what we're doing is pulling together 3 themes around the cost of living to take forward through the task force. So the first one is managing finances, the second one managing at home, so housing, heating and eating, and thirdly mental health and wellbeing. I'll just talk about those in some more detail. Thanks. Next slide. So managing finances. So this, as I say, I think it's important again to sort of repeat myself, but there is work going on this already. We have a smaller group of who've been meeting, so that's Citizens Advice, Plymouth Energy Community and Food Plymouth have been meeting to develop and talk about things, for example, such as bringing sort of debt advice and financial advice into the community more, so working closely with the wellbeing hubs, having trained volunteers who are able to come into the community and supported by citizens' advice to provide advice where needed to increase access. And I'm sure that Emma and colleague will be able to talk about that in more detail if you'd like to hear more about that. But so there is focus on this, but I think we do need to do more, and I think things like working out how frontline staff might be able to provide, ask perhaps different questions. Frontline council staff and other organisational staff could ask different questions perhaps and help to signpost residents to appropriate advice using our online directory. So those are some of the things that we're looking at in terms of managing finances. So in terms of managing at home, so again, we are working very much, we have over the last 2 years been managing the government's household support funding, which does focus very much on energy, and there is a third round coming up now, and we will be pulling together proposals for the household support fund, which focuses on supporting people with energy bills. But clearly, again, we know we don't want to be complacent. There's a lot more that needs to be done, and we will be working with our colleagues on making sure that there's access to information and advice, and we supporting households there, and working very much with community connections around how do we target, for example, the household support fund to people who are at risk of becoming homeless, so that we can help them to pay their bills and potentially, prevent them from needing to not being able to pay their rent or their other housing costs, for example. Thank you. And then mental health and wellbeing. This again is about understanding the impact on people's mental health. We've done a lot of work on looking at the impact on people's mental health and wellbeing, as you've heard from Sarah already this morning, and signposting to support that's available. So it's recognising that really and making sure that everybody understands what support is available and how we can help people. We have got a lot of I would say quite a lot of preventative low-level work going on in communities around things like such as wellbeing hubs and the community mental health framework that Sarah talks about, and the voluntary sector who are involved in that. We're working very closely with them. Thank you. Next slide. So I think what we're going to be doing is taking a graduated response. So in terms of each of those themes, there clearly will be the urgent need for support. And so, for example, if you take food, urgent support would be, for example, people needing a food bank. But then what we want to do is, in the longer term, looking at emerging needs and actually putting in place longer term support. So rather than having food banks, which people relying on that, we want to put in place things like social supermarket, food larders, where people actually contribute towards the cost of the food, but it's a membership scheme where you get much reduced good food but at a reduced price. So there's lots of other things we can put in place which will support people with emerging needs. And then ultimately resilience, the aim is to actually put in place enough early prevention, working with communities in the voluntary sector, so that actually people live in resilient communities and are able to, they know their rights, they've got things that they're able to deal with their debts, and we can support people to be resilient. And that should be our business as usual approach. So those are the three kind of levels that we will be, our plan will address. Thanks. Next slide. So we have, as I say, we have the three work streams and the partners that are involved in those. Certainly communications will be a key part of this, and our communications team are working at the moment to review the website, but also look at other comms, and we will be looking at comms as well around the professionals and people working, as I say, in places where they can do some good signposting. Obviously, really important to make sure that we've got a work stream around managing at home and bringing all those things together. So I think, as I would say, that this work is already happening. Lots of this is going on, but what we want to do through this task force is make sure it's coordinated and make sure that everybody clearly understands the approach and that we're communicating effectively about what's available. Thanks. And then next slide. And then there are other work streams which are enabling this work to happen. So community empowerment is very much about, as I say, working with communities and making sure that people are able to support themselves wherever possible. So putting in place support to community activity. So where there are groups of residents who want, for example, to set up a food co-op, we're putting in place support for them to be able to do that. It's about making sure that everybody is equipped to be able to provide that support. Digital inclusion, there's quite a lot of work going on around digital inclusion in the city. Some really positive things are happening there with getting people access to both software and sort of hardware as well, and get access to, because as we appreciate that a lot of information that people need is online. The inclusive growth work that the City Council does, again working to make sure that businesses are, and that we're skilling up people who would like to get into work and supporting people to get into work, and that businesses are taking opportunities to make sure we're increasing the access to work for people in those disadvantaged communities. Thrive Plymouth and the Wellbeing Hubs we've already talked about, and work going on, I say, around early intervention and prevention. The Child Poverty Action Plan very much links to this, and so the Child Poverty Action Plan will be building on that, working with that group as well in terms of how we address the cost of living. And there's lots of other work streams around wellbeing. We have funding, health funding actually, to put in place a team of community builders who are effectively community development workers who'll be starting in November, working in the most deprived communities in Plymouth, and working with communities on putting in place health and wellbeing support. So that's another piece of work and resource that's coming into play shortly. As I say, emerging areas for work then going forward are, as we've said, signposting and joining up the offer, taking the tiered approach, including helping people to help themselves where possible, collaboration around the Household Support Fund with the partners, which we've been doing for the last 2 years, and we'll be continuing to do in round 3, which starts in October and goes on to next March. I'm going to talk a bit about warm spaces and employers in the next few remaining slides. So in terms of warm spaces, obviously this is an issue that has been raised nationally, and a lot of local authorities are considering this. What we're looking to do in Plymouth is collaborate with organisations where there already are spaces which people can use. So we're pulling together, we're collating lists of places which people can go to where they can keep warm. There might be some tea or coffee. There might even be opportunities to work together with other people in terms of cooking and sharing food, etc. Lots of organisations have already come forward actually, so we've got a lot of the churches have come forward, lots of organisations, some city council spaces, other businesses, cafes, restaurants, pubs. So there are going to be quite a long list, I think, really, of places, and obviously what we'll make sure is that we'll have a geographic picture of where those are and the times when they're open and when people can go. And we'll think about what we might want to offer there. So, for example, pop-up advice on energy and other advice as well could be on offer. We're just putting that together, and that will be available through the task force. We work with the task force on that. And then final 2 slides really about employers. So we're keen to make sure we work with employers on how they can support their staff. This is something that City Council is also looking at itself. So we have, for example, the council has already got financial workshops for its staff to come to talk about their finances, and we have lots of work around, and the City Council has lots of work with its staff around mental health and wellbeing. We do a lot of that already. We're talking to the other employers such as UHP, University Hospital Plymouth, about what they can do as well. They're very keen to do more for their staff. So we are putting that in place, working very closely with our economic development colleagues, and through their network, through the network of businesses that they've got in economic development as well. They're putting in place, and we've got the workplace to wellbeing offer as well from public health. So there's lots of work going on with employers. And the final slide just touches on some other suggestions for employers, which which might be ideas for staff, for example, setting up food clubs, bulk purchasing of food, and just sharing advice and information on how to on lower cost food and recipes and so on. And then, as I said already, we're talking about potential warm spaces that employers might be able to offer. So that's a sort of summary of where we are on that.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Before we have questions, shall we go on to the second presentation and then have questions, or would it be easier to do one? Probably better to have the second presentation and then questions in the round, isn't it? So can I welcome Emma Handley and Jaroslava Pertikova? Have I got it right? more or less, from Citizens Advice to deliver the presentation that they have on cost of living concerns and experiences. Thank you.
Hello everyone, thank you for inviting us today, Rachel, to support the work that Rachel and the cost of living. Can you not hear me?
Mic a little bit nearer, pull the machine a bit nearer maybe. Thanks.
Is that better?
Slight problems with it today.
Yeah, do say. So my name's Emma, I'm the Chief Officer at Citizens Advice Plymouth, and Yaroslava is our Research and Campaigns Manager. So we circulated the report, so we're just going to talk to the report really, and then Yaroslava will take through what we're seeing coming through and the types of profile of clients that we're experiencing, which relates to what Rachel said, and then I will talk through the recommendations following Yaroslava's detail on the report.
Thank you. So Britain is facing the biggest cost of living crisis in decades. The current crisis impacts Plymouth residents daily and severely impacts the most vulnerable as people must make difficult decisions about what to cut back on and how to make their ends meet. Since the beginning of this financial year, over 2,500 of Plymouth residents contacted Citizens Advice on a variety of issues. Moreover, further 69,000 searched advice on Citizens Advice self-help pages. Over 63% of those contacting the service over the telephone, web chat or face-to-face inquired advice on the cost of living issues. Over 60% of them live with long-term health conditions or disability. Our data reveals that many Plymouth families live on the edge of poverty. According to Plymouth data, 19% of Plymouth children live in poverty. With upcoming winter and fuel prices significantly increasing, Citizens Advice calculations predict that this is going to get worse. I'll just walk you through our charts. So our recent analysis shows that the cost of living crisis has been gradually increasing since the beginning of 2019. The peak was reached in July 2022 when we opened the Household Support Fund applications on our website. So in 2 weeks' time, we received nearly 700 applications to this fund, and we had to close it quite early, as we did not have funding to fund more applications. Our advisors are concerned that more people rely on support of food banks, fuel vouchers, and other charitable grants to apply for white goods or furniture for their social housing. On the top of this, more clients need assistance with PIP applications and PIP appeals. The current application process for disability benefits is too long and pushes the most vulnerable people to destitution. Therefore, it is important that people have access to right financial support for their disabilities and long-term health conditions at the right time. On our charts, you can see that issues have decreased since the beginning of December 2021. And this was caused by changes to MAPS contract and changes to our workforce. So we went down from 4 MAPS caseworkers to just 1 MAPS caseworker. So our current debt advice to local residents doesn't reflect the real situations in the city. Moreover, over the course of the past couple of months, we have also seen significant increase in evictions in private and social housing. So this is impacted by the current situation of the market and more people being issued a Section 21. Our analysis also found that females were more likely to seek advice on the cost of living inquiries. We believe this probably reflects Plymouth populations and also overall client profile of our Citizens Advice clients. The chart 4 on page 9 also highlights that over 60% of Plymouth residents seeking advice on the cost of living had long-term health conditions or disability. Many of them will also face increases in fuel charges and electricity costs due to their health conditions such as diabetes, lupus or cancer, because they must heat their homes. The data also shows that a third of Plymouthians had multiple impairments and further third suffered from mental health problems. Increasing financial pressure on these households can also exacerbate situations in upcoming months. We have also reported more people in part-time employment and retirement. The chart on page 10 also shows that approximately a third of our clients were also those households who were permanently sick, disabled, and further 19% were unemployed. The largest group with cost of living issues were single people, followed by single parents with dependent children. The ONS report states that adult households with children spend approximately £291 per year more than single households. Announcement of fuel price increases could add additional pressure on families and with children and deepen the poverty across the city. Our data also suggests that more social housing tenants are seeking advice on the cost of living. So the chart on the page 14 shows that the number of people in private housing with cost of living problems has decreased in 2022. However, the number of people living in social housing has significantly increased, and this reflects what Rachel said in previous presentation. Also, we have seen increase in people who are living in council housing as well. So these are people who have low financial incomes, and possibly the increase in cost of living will require more funding towards this area. Our data also revealed that more people across of the city were affected by the financial crisis. When we compare Q1 and Q2 of this financial year with the same quarters in the previous financial year, we found out that the people in financial crisis, the number increased by 167%. And on our maps, on the page 15, you can see how the map has changed across the city over the 2 years. You can see that more areas live in deprivation and they need more financial assistance. The most impacted areas across the city were St. Peter and the waterfront, Devonport, Stoke, Efford and Lipson and Honignovel. And these areas have also a large proportion of people who live with disability and other long-term health conditions. So we believe that these areas probably will need more attention in upcoming months, and therefore we would like to suggest the Council a number of recommendations how you could tackle this crisis and help us to improve policies and conditions for people across the city and maybe across the country as well.
So so far as recommendations, which we've listed on page 17, the work that, again, that the task force is doing is fantastic, and there's a huge amount of collaboration happening across the city and a lot of initiatives, but we feel actually this is about system change. We requested to go to scrutiny around this because we feel so deeply now that actually we need to be talking to government to change, and I know that's probably very rose-tinted, but we can put a sticking plaster on this, but actually there's some really quite important system changes that need to happen. The three I'm going to highlight are around the PIP waiting time. So if it takes 6 or 9 months for a decision, We're also seeing if that decision is turned down and we go to appeal and put work in for appeal, that decision can be over a year for somebody who literally needs that money in their pocket as soon as they require it. So we need to reduce the waiting times on decisions. The cost of going insolvent. Plymouth is one of the highest insolvency rates across the country, but it costs people to become. One of the debt solutions would be for a debt relief order or for bankruptcy, but it costs to do that. I'm concerned where people will be getting that money from in order even just to go bankrupt, if that is the right solution for them. So we need to see the reduction in insolvency rates come down. Also, deductions from benefits. So if, for example, you have somebody on universal credit who may be in work, we're seeing that kind of it could be up to 40% for their income going on energy, and then they have a deduction from that benefit. It really doesn't leave them with any money to live on. So if there was a cap on deductions from benefit, again, this really is about needing to put more money in people's pockets. So we have those recommendations that we've made is an action that we would like the council to take, if that is at all possible, and where we take that. Other recommendations linked to what Rachel said around us all really working closely together in the city, and I do believe we're doing that. There's a couple of tweaks maybe, particularly around maybe digital exclusion and ensuring that people who require access to support and all of the work that's happening in the city, that the digitally excluded, that they also have access in order. There's a case study in the report also around an example of where that's not happened and that person's not been able to get that support that they need. So I don't know if you want to add anything. No. So yeah. So we are quite concerned. We're already seeing that it's called a crisis, but it actually is a crisis. Sorry to kind of be doom and gloom, but we need to, I believe we need to start taking more action on fixing the problem.
Thank you very much for your reports. Kathy Watkin, question?
Yes, going back to the first report, it seems that children from single-parent families are disproportionately affected. Are you working with schools to see if they can help and advise parents and children?
Yes, we do. We do work with schools very much, and one of the things that we've been doing, for example, with the Household Support Fund, is providing food vouchers for families over the school holidays, which the schools have been identifying those families, both on free school meals, but also other families in hardship. But we definitely we'll want to be working with schools on this issue. Yeah.
Sue.
Thank you, Chair. I live and indeed represent as one of the 3 councillors St Peter in the Waterfront Ward, and where I live I've seen people telling me they've got to move, and I'm asking why, and they say there's something called no fault evictions, and there's a big rush on this because apparently the law is going to change. So we've seen a huge spike in people having to get out of their homes that they've lived in, and one lives next door to me, and she's got a husband, 3 children. The children are teenagers, current rising teenagers. They're hoping to do their A levels. Parents work, not that they have to, but this is the family, and they're almost distraught rather, because they don't know where they're going to go. They don't know if the children can continue at the schools where they're very happy and they're doing quite well. So I don't know when do we know when these no fault evictions are going to end? Is there a sudden rush because the law's going to change? Is that what's caused the spike? Because the landlords and landladies say they can get more money if these people go and they can just raise the rents. Is that right?
I'm not sure. Well, we can check that. We can check our information.
Okay, thanks.
There was a spike after the pandemic because there was a hold on no fault evictions at that particular point. the government is also looking at the moment to reform private rented sector as well, so that will be the basis for that as well.
Oh, so they're rushing to
but,
get
but
in.
we certainly saw the spike just after the lockdown period in particular, and that was lifted, and that's reflected in our B&B numbers, which are at unprecedented levels within the City Council, circa 180 people at any one time, up from pre-pandemic days of 18 people, so you can see the effect of those. And the most common cause of homelessness that we're seeing come through is through no fault evictions.
Thank you.
We have also seen cases where landlords were selling their properties because at the moment there's a right market and they were just going with the market, and then that means for people, if they need to move, possibly their rents are going to be higher because the rents have increased across the city. So more people will have to fund additional fundings for, for example, housing element of universal credit, because the housing element will not cover the full part of rent, so therefore there will be a shortfall in people's budget.
I think this extends to all the services as well, including the police. We're seeing, domestic violence also coming through. I think, the number of consistently, we run some national contracts with energy providers, and there's a sharp increase in the number of cases we're getting through for domestic violence, and I'm sure that would be reflected in the city as well. So, there's an effect on police and how that's managed as well.
Mary.
The City Council task force that we've got, is it cross-party or is it just? I'm not too sure who's making up that, Rachel. And the other thing that really, picking up on what Sue said there, if families are not being able to find accommodation that they can afford, etc., it then comes back to us and Community Connections, because then we're going to have to find temporary accommodation. So to me, it's prudent for us to be following through on these recommendations that's come from the Citizens Advice report, because the buck will stop with the council, basically, in that it will be those extra pressures on the council, let alone, as you say, Sue, having to move a child from a school that they're in. If, let's just say, they end up being put in accommodation up, let's say in Southway, who's going to pay for the school the transport to get that child back to the school that they were going into where they were? And there's a whole problem, isn't it? And I think we have to take this very seriously. And this is the tip of the iceberg. It's the 1st of October when all of these, a lot of the energy costs will be rising. We know that food costs are rising. We also then know that people that would normally subscribe and put monies into food banks, they could quite easily be ending up being a client of a food bank rather than somebody that's been able to give some benefit. So we can't hang around with this. This isn't going to be something that we can park till the next financial year. There's a whole lot of things coming. Well, it's that chickens to roost, isn't it, basically? So it's important that the task force isn't a talking shop, which I'm sure with Rachel guiding it isn't a talking shop, but it could be. And I think that's where it's got to be an action thing, not just something about saying, oh yes, we will do X, Y, or Z. We're running out of time. So I think, Chair, there's got to be some real follow-up on this.
Could Rachel give us a quick update on the task force and exactly who's on it and what's happening with it at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to emphasise that all the partners are very keen to see it as an action-focused group. In fact, that was one of the points that was made by, I think it was Alistair from Plymouth Energy Community, that he wanted it to be action-focused and not just a group that ruminates on the problems. Absolutely, that's our aim. And what we've got, so we've got in terms of partners who are on it. So it's chaired by Councillor Rebecca Smith, and then we've got Food Plymouth, Citizens Advice, Plymouth Energy Community, Community Connections, Transforming Plymouth Together, which is a churches network. And I think those are the key partners, and there may be a couple of others that we need to invite as well. We've got what the task force will be. I think we'll identify key issues that need to be addressed, and then we'll have small working groups that will go off and do work and come back. And certainly already there's a group that's looking at Christmas. I know that Transforming Plymouth Together, the churches are very keen to talk about the just coordinating any provision that might be around the Christmas period. And then also we're going to obviously have a work stream on warm spaces. So there will be actions very much coming out of the task force. It won't just be a talking shop.
Chair, I think one of those things that I've not heard is that the opposition is not included in that. And that concerns me, because to me it needs to be a joint thing that we're dealing with. So I think that's just something that I'm picking up from that. But I welcome what's happening, and I think it does also bother me about this digital inclusion. Having sat on Padan for many years, I know people with disabilities aren't always up to scratch, shall we say, with the internet stuff. We got a grant to issue IT equipment to people, and very few people took it up. And I think some of it is because they don't want to use it. It's as simple as that. They don't have the skills and the confidence sometimes to use it. So I think we need to be aware, as Rachel is saying, that it can't just go on the council's website because people won't use it. It's coming back again to these warm spaces being accessible, that it's in the communities, and as you say, churches and that are brilliant to be able to do things like that, but they don't want to be able to have to jump on a bus to go and do X, Y or Z. It needs to be that close contact, and the same with debt advice and all of that. Like it's utilising those hubs, isn't it, that's out there. But I just don't think we know yet how much demand it's going to be, and I just hope this is something that we can expand as and when, because we don't know quite, do we? I mean, you're talking about schools. Somebody could be 10p under the rules for getting free school meals, and that will make the difference between them feeding themselves and their children. And so, yeah, it's something that the Health and Wellbeing hubs within the areas are going to have to be feeding in those data sets, aren't they, so that we know what's happening and we can be responsive, because it is going to fall on our shoulders, isn't it, Craig, in the end, if people are being this section 21 evictions and all of that lot. It's going to fall on us if they can't afford the private rented rent allowance, it's not meeting it. So there's a whole complicated scheme that needs to be sorted.
I mean, Rachel, are any other councillors involved with this task force?
So I need to check, because I think that there has been an invitation to the opposition, but I would need to check that with Rebecca. I'm pretty sure there was, but sorry, I can't confirm that.
We'd all be interested to know whether that has happened and exactly what form that's going to take. So it'd be grateful if you perhaps could feed those of us who are here today back with a response on that, and then we can report back to our groups. Yeah, as you say, Mayor, it's a very complicated area, because I think the new legislation on tenancy and rights of not being evicted are actually causing a problem in the short term, with more people who are being evicted at not a good time for many people in many areas. So it's and I think some landlords are getting out of the business. So it's very multi-faceted. I think. I mean, maybe it's an area for scrutiny.
It's the no-fault evictions.
But there's a lot of, it's got to be reactive and rapidly reactive rather than thinking, oh, I've got to take it to this committee, that committee, or whatever. It's got to be precise. And as you say, it's day to day, it will change, isn't it? And I suppose also we need to look and see what advice and help is available over weekends when we aren't always around, because crises could happen on a Friday night, can't they? And how do we manage that? So yeah, I think it's a huge ask of this task force and this council to make sure that we're working with everybody possible, isn't it, to make life to help sort these big problems out that may arise, they may not. Again, it's not knowing, isn't it?
Just to come back on that, Mary, I think you're right. I think the task force has to be action oriented and move at pace. But there's also something for me about keeping an eye on the longer term and feeding through some longer term, because affordable housing is one of the big issues that we're confronting, lack of affordable housing that we're confronted with as well. We can't grow that overnight, Mary. So I think it is focusing on the here and now, but not losing those big themes and then escalating those big themes back to things like the Health and Wellbeing Board. I'd also say this is not a city council agenda. This is a city agenda. Because it has impacts on health partners, voluntary community sectors, and everybody as well. So let's not lose sight. It's not just a city council agenda; it's a city agenda.
Thank you, Craig. Are there any more questions? No. Well, thank you for the report.
Sorry, could I just ask what will happen with the recommendations that we've put forward, and whether we filtered that? I think we've talked about that within the task group anyway, but what the next steps would be?
Yeah, Rachel, are you going to respond to that, or is Elliot going to respond?
Yeah, through you, Chair. Thank you. So there are a number obviously set out before you. If anyone on the board today wants to propose and gets a seconder for an individual one of these recommendations, we can pass that through. Alternatively, my recommendation is that we take this outside, consult with both the health scrutiny and with Craig and Anna, and work, because some of these are not just applicable to the board. They require party and council consensus.
They're quite wide-ranging, as you say, Elliot, and beyond the scope of this board. And of course, the issues are not that raised today are not just due to the cost of living problems we're experiencing at the moment. There are other longer-term issues, particularly around housing and availability of rented properties and whatever. So,
sorry, Chair. I mean, my point would be this. I would not think this is a place for this board to do it, because it is a city-wide board, so it's got other partners on, so it's not just a city council board. I think that's really important to note. But I do think there is something around, has the task force got this report, Emma in particular, and then how is it feeding into that work programme as well, and then looking at those recommendations. So I think that would be the direction from my point of view into that task force. And certainly the report, which is clearly evidence-based, etc., to use that, and I presume that's being considered, Rachel.
so at this point, should we just be asked to note it, but the reports be dealt with and looked at by Rachel and the task force going forward?
Elliot, do we need to find out which scrutiny committee this would fall under? Because it's going to be one of those, presumably between health and Chris Penberthy's performance, whatever it is, isn't it? I think we need to find out where it sits, or whether Rachel's going to have to do something joint between us, because obviously there's which scrutiny does it go? So I think probably to the management board, as soon as possible, for the management board to sort out where it goes.
Okay. That would be excellent. Is everyone happy with that?
Yes, as long as we get it back at some point.
Well, if it goes to the management board, something will happen, Mary. You will ensure that, won't you? Yeah. Mary will ensure that. Well, thank you for everyone for their contributions over on that subject. Now, tracking decisions. I did have the sheet of paper, just now, but I seem to have refiled it. There was only one tracking decision. It's been actioned. We've got a meeting
Yes,
later in.
There was
November.
one tracking decision relating to the provision of Thrive Plymouth training, and Rob Nelder has agreed a provisional date which will be circulated to yourselves in due time.
Good, thank you. So that brings us to the work programme. And Elliot, you. My copy is lost in the big pack as well.
So Chair, for the January meeting, Chair, we have no items on the agenda at the moment, although the terms of reference review has been deferred, so would suggest that needs to go into there.
But we've got a November meeting as well, haven't we? Because I've been discussing the agenda for the Health and Wellbeing Board with Ruth Harrell for November.
As far as I was aware at the start of the year, there are only 4 scheduled. I have heard something about November, so there is a potential one of them has been shifted.
That's interesting.
I'll get back to you in due time, but if we just agree a slight agenda for the next meeting, regardless of date, we'll get that moved out.
I mean, I've definitely had a conversation. I had a meeting about the agenda for the November meeting with Ruth Harrell about 10 days ago, at which some things are being put together, including this potential grant of money that's coming to do some work into health inequalities or looking into it. So there's definitely something happening in November.
Sorry, can I?
Do you think she got muddled?
I think I know. Sorry, I've jumped in now. I think I know what the November thing is. I think the November session is a specific public health session. Sort of it's badged as, I've got the email from Ruth here to the team telling us what we need to be doing in November. That's why I'm able to say about it. So I mean, it's basically, she's saying scrutiny agenda has been agreed with Councillor Mahoney. It's almost like a public health scrutiny session in November, if that's the one that Ruth was talking to you about.
Okay.
I think, John, you've got muddled there, and it's it's the scrutiny in November, not the Health and Wellbeing Board in November. I think that's.
Right.
I think you've got your meetings. Yeah.
It's a little bit odd that Ruth Harrell should be discussing with me the agenda for the scrutiny panel.
I think she's giving you the courtesy of being the cabinet member and just advising you. Perhaps that's the way to phrase it.
It's your meeting in November, and our next meeting is January. Apologies for that confusion.
So there are several items on the work programme in front of you to be scheduled, which we can discuss between. I'll defer to Craig on which ones are relevant to come.
So just to flag up things which I think will be appropriate in January anyway. One will be, so the integrated care system is producing an integrated care strategy. They have to by law. So that will set out at Devon-wide level the future direction around integrated care. So it would feel appropriate that that document comes to this board because it's a strategic document. And then also what this board hasn't received for a long time, Chair, is an update on the local care partnership and their progress against the 6 priorities. So that would feel appropriate to come to those with the revised terms of reference.
Okay. So we'll have those on the agenda, and there might be something else by the time we get to it. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Well, thank you for everyone's time this morning and all the work and effort that people have put in, and the questioning. And I will